Okay. Hi, and welcome to Para Talk One-on-One. And my guest today is Michelle Belanger. She is an author, presenter, teacher, occult expert. She was featured on Paranormal State. You are also a psychic and energy worker as well as a singer.
Yeah,
You do so much.
I get
Where
bored
do
easy.
you find the time?
Uh, I also don't sleep a whole lot.
Uh, okay, I can see that. I can totally see that. So, I mean, honestly, out of all of these things that you are known for, what what truly stands out? Like, what's in your heart?
Since I was tiny, if you ask me what I was, it's a writer. And it's writing and it's the books that got me into any of the TV stuff in the first place. Uh,
Hmm.
so Paranormal State, for example, Elfie Music and Josh Light were both fans of my work. And as they were getting scouted for the show, uh, the first season, they realized that they needed someone who was basically like their lifeline. So, like, here's what would happen. I wasn't on the show for first season, but I would get this call at like 4 in the morning.
Hmm.
Hey, we're up in the backwoods of Maine and we think it might be a Wendigo. There's like an Indian burial ground. Here's what's going on. Lorraine Warren's head spinning around. She says there's all sorts of stuff. She's wandering around in a white linen skirt in the woods, by the way, and like sensible heels. And do you have a book on this? Well, and I've got a library of at this point in the neighborhood of 5,000 books.
Hmm.
Back it was about 3,000 or so, and it was my resource library because I've got a degree in comparative religious studies. One of the things that I learned really quick when I was working on any of my papers and theses in college was my stuff was so obscure that I would have to wait 3 weeks to months for interlibrary loan for anything to come through because this is
Hmm.
before the days of the internet. It was just easier to go buy it, like
Right.
here, and then just have it on hand. So I've just got all of these weird, obscure books, grimoires, reproductions in almost all cases of like magic books on summoning demons from the 15th century and whatever else. So I was the lifeline.
So you ended up coming on the show. This show lasted for how many seasons? It was
Uh,
like five?
it was from I think 2006 to 2011, so technically 5 seasons.
About 5 seasons.
The way they did seasons was a little bit weird because it was again back in the day, like a season was 12 to 24 episodes, and then we were getting filmed like in that weird spot where suddenly seasons were sometimes like half seasons, and
Hmm.
so technically 5 seasons. Like I know that there's like 5 DVD sets out there, uh,
Right.
the last of
And
which
what
I've seen.
did they just pull you out over one day and just say, "Come on, you're going to be on the show"?
Well, what the first way that happened was they had, and I think it's the episode called Good versus Evil, and it involves a family that has, frankly, it's a souvenir voodoo doll that somebody sent them from the French Quarter, and they had
Nice.
voodoo expert, and I'm going to put air quotes for that because as it turned out, and they had conversations with the person who put themselves forward as a voodoo expert,
Hmm.
uh, they were a white person who'd read one book. Like let's be honest.
Oh wow. Okay.
And like they really were not an expert on this, and it became really obvious in the interview, and so they scrapped that and kind of out of desperation because they're in the middle of the investigation. They're like, "What do you know about voodoo?" And I'm like, "Well, first of all, I am not a practitioner. Like, I
Right.
no ties to this. I have done some research and some studies. Are like, do you at least know enough to be able to say what one could expect from this little thing and what any of these symbols would mean?" And I'm like, that I could do. Also, that's not really a voodoo doll. Like, just for the record, like that's a souvenir. Um,
Right.
so I ended up just on phone with them about that, and subsequent to that, a thing that a lot of people didn't know watching the show was Elfie Music had lost her father and her brother in rapid succession in this otherwise very stressful time of her life, as like she's kind of like this bookish introvert who is suddenly on TV and thrust in the public eye with like this like show that had like 3.5 million viewers at one point.
Hmm.
And she was supposed to be their occult expert, but she'd gotten very, very withdrawn. And they wanted someone, they had the idea of having a a mentor for her come on the show. So initially, when they pulled me onto the show, that's what my job description was going to be. I was going to be an occult expert. I came out to a specific episode called The Messenger, and it was up in like Oregon, Gold Beach, so right on the Oregon-Washington state border.
Mm-hmm.
And through a very curious series of events, that episode did not go as planned in terms of what my role was, partly because there were plane delays. A PA ended up picking up me and Chip Coffey, and Chip Coffey was the person who was slotted to be the psychic for the show. Well, we ended up taking a wrong turn onto a logging road for, I think it was something in the neighborhood of 52 miles. It was a harrowing drive, and just like the turn that you see in bad movies. Points where there's logging trucks coming at us this way on this tiny little like gravel path. There is a sheer drop. Well, one thing leads to another throughout this entire harrowing experience, as I'm kind of like calling out like, hey guys, I think we're going to get a flat tire. And then we did. And Chip is like, are you psychic? Are you psychic, girl? And I'm like, well, I write books about that, and I've been teaching people how to deal with their psychic abilities for years at this point. So yeah, but I'm here as the occult expert. Well, Chip got the idea to keep me separate, to cloister me when we finally arrived. He did his walkthrough, and just kind of like as a let's see who hits what, mm-hmm. He then had me do a walkthrough as well. And like I'd used techniques like that with students in the past, a kind of dueling psychic to see who gets, where people get the same hits and how they interpret the stuff.
Right.
Well, we ended up picking up all the same spots, the same places in the house that we felt were hot spots. And while our techniques are really quite different and our language is different, we still hit very similar things. And at that point, at the end of that episode, the director and the other powers that be are going, so what, when we put the little tagline under your name, what do we put there? And I'm like, well, you could put this. I mean, you could put occult researcher. You could put, how about psychic medium? And I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, I guess like it's more about helping people understand what I'm doing. But I mean, shaman, okay, everything else is like way too long. I'm like, well, mystic, shamanistic practitioner, not shaman, because I'm not a shaman. But and so I was a psychic medium.
Right. Now, do you think that show, I mean, honestly, helped you in the end with all of this fame? In other words, if you had not been on the show, do you think you would be as popular as you are right now with just the books and the teachings and all of that stuff? Because I find what you do fascinating, and I love, that you love to teach. I love that you do these lectures and presentations and teaching on, how psychic self-defense and about lucid dreaming and stuff like that separately. But that show, was that just major?
It had a huge impact. People respond differently to you if you've been on TV, for good or for bad. Suddenly you are a much more respectable and much more authoritative figure. So as an example, like I live in, Midwestern Ohio. Like the small town I live in has a gazebo, and they do like concerts in the park in this little town square every day of summer. Like it is like a throwback to a completely different era, along with its politics and its attitudes toward people. And I'm 6'1", have dressed in black since I was probably like 13. I was the weird, kind of creepy neighbor that people whispered about.
Right.
And then I was on TV. And suddenly, I wasn't weird, I was interesting.
Okay, I got it.
So that's a huge impact. On a personal level, the other thing that was really useful for me as someone who likes to take what I'll loosely describe as a skeptical approach, or maybe a rational approach to my psychic abilities, I accept that there are abilities that I have, there are perceptions that I get that seem to have a non-linear chain of perception that lead me to information. I'm not 100% convinced that all of it is what we can consider magical or mystical or psychic. And as someone who is relatively perceptive, regardless of psychic stuff, when doing stuff locally with people that I already knew, it never felt like I could 100% guarantee that I wasn't just reading people's body language, just knowing things about people, inferring things. Like, part of my degree is also in psychology, so I do have I know how to read people. Going to some random person's house on the other side of the country, spending like the first 2 days cloistered in a hotel room playing Diablo 2 most of the time, getting blindfolded from the time I step out of the hotel. Thank goodness I don't get car sick. Blindfolded
Right.
car ride, and then walk through this place with like no anything. And to have the information come through that is even remotely accurate was incredibly instructive for me. I mean, one, it helped me really understand what it feels like to have what I will call a legitimate psychic impression, as opposed to when somebody says, when you walk into a room blindfolded, what do you feel? Well, your brain's gonna like try to make some shit up.
Right.
Like that's the way brains work. It's gonna be like, well, now I
Right.
have a question, and I'm a writer of fiction as well as nonfiction, so I know I've got a vivid imagination.
Hmm.
And so being able to be in the situation where I go in cold, I do the thing, and then separate from me, other people research and confirm what happened.
Hmm.
It vastly built my confidence in the ability, my ability to recognize what was my inside voice, like my expectation, my imagination, and
Hmm.
what was something that was definitely coming from outside of me. So
Right.
that was invaluable for me.
Right. Now, I used to watch the show, and I always watched you do that Gansfeld experiment on the show. And, you know, I've tried that before, and not so good.
Really
It's,
wasn't my thing. Like
it's,
Sergey loved it, and
uh-huh.
I will say that for some people it works really, really well, because for some people the problem is distractions outside here. But I do so much work by like if I descend into myself, I do so much meditation work that hooking me up to a Gansfeld or something that's going to be any other sensory deprivation. Most
Hmm.
it just drops me into, and now I'm meditating about stuff. And yeah, I was never really keen on it. Also, the amount of like white noise loud that you needed in your ears
Right.
was fun. I did not enjoy that.
My problem with it was that I always ended up with something negative
Mm-hmm.
coming home with me
Oh,
after
okay.
the experiment, and that would last for days.
Mm.
It would just get worse and worse over time. And so I got to the point where I was like, okay, I don't even want to mess with this anymore.
Oh, that's fair. I will say, when it comes to like psychic self-defense
Hmm.
protection, I grew up essentially in the psychic school of hard knocks, like where I grew up and the people around me. So I learned at a pretty early age how to have really strong shields, really strong boundaries,
Hmm.
recognize when something was like really not okay, and sort of what to do about that. And we don't get to see it on a lot of the episodes, but behind the scenes, uh, frequently, my other role in addition to psychic was basically the person who sat down with the family and taught them how to protect themselves, and how not to be victims. And in some
Right.
cases it was just a matter of recognizing that what was in their house wasn't actually threatening, but it was scary because they didn't know what to expect from it.
Right.
And sometimes what was in their house was really not okay. And I'm sorry, not everybody has the wherewithal or the financial security to just pick up and move from one house to another just because there's something creepy there.
Right.
So it's a matter of learning accurate threat assessment, but also how do you set up boundaries? How do you protect yourself? How do you recognize when an attack is happening? And then what do you do, especially if you've got children who
Right.
might not be able to protect themselves, or
Hmm.
pets, because pets end up being victimized sometimes too.
Right. Now, I believe I saw a video once that you had that actually spoke about people who are psychic or sensitive, if you
Mm.
want to call it that. And you actually spoke about allowing them that they're going to have to go through all of these things in order to learn what works for them
Hmm.
in order to defend themselves. against these things.
I am a firm believer that there's no single book, and this is me, a writer, saying this, that's
Right.
going to explain how this works for you.
Right.
It's always going to be my perspective. As somebody who's psychic, most of my experiences, I'm a highly visual person.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of my perceptions are visual. When I describe them, they are usually in very visual terms. Well, for somebody who experiences it differently, and there are many people who do, that gives them this very unfair bias of, well, I'm not experiencing it like this person, so therefore I must be wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've spent a lot of my time as a teacher with these, helping people to understand that, first of all, your inner experience, not just as a psychic being, but as a psychological being, is vastly different from anybody else around you. Like, it is your own head, and everything is going to present in your particular symbol set, in language, in your mental language. So
Mm-hmm.
first thing you have to understand always is your interior world, your relationship to your perceptions, on a practical level before you even get to the psychic level. And practice is a huge part of that. Like,
Right.
keeping a journal also is something, like, I know not everybody likes to write. And these days with cell phones and whatnot, it's so much easier where, like, if you're not somebody who's going to, like, sit there and scribble down your experiences, you can just talk at your phone.
Right.
And having a record to go back to, that was something that, I have a, a mixed relationship with my grandmother, who has since passed away. But what I will say is she was psychic. She was incredibly psychic. She didn't always use her powers for good, and we'll just leave it at that. But her best advice to me at one point, it was actually when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up,
Mm-hmm.
7th grade. The night before, I'd had a dream, and it was a predictive dream. And I didn't think anything of it. I went to school because, I mean, why would that happen? And it
Right.
happened, and I about crapped myself. And I came home with this struggle that a lot of people who have any kind of predictive experience go through at least once. Could I have stopped it?
Right.
Was the message that I was given, did I fail to act? What could I have done differently? And as I'm telling my grandma what had happened, she's like, well, anybody can be psychic after the fact. And then that sounds like a cruel thing to say to a 7th grader. It's very in keeping with her. But it was very useful. Like what she followed that up with was, if this happens again, write it out as soon as you wake up. Keep a record of these flashes. Keep a record of these things. One, you'll be able to understand them better. And two, you're going to then have the record for when it happens.
Mm,
And
right.
so it makes it more credible. And I took that to heart. It's a fantastic lesson. As a 7th grader, it was a little bit weird to hear at first, but again, it's incredibly useful, because you can go back and see where you're right, also where you may have misinterpreted something.
Mm-hmm.
Giving yourself a hard copy of any psychic experience, not just a prescient dream, but it lets you, one, it keeps you honest. Memory is an incredibly fallible thing. It's not nearly as hardline as we think it is. So if
Mm-hmm.
you write it down without interpreting, it keeps us from having that experience where it's like, well, what I was dreaming about was actually a Lego ship that exploded, but that's totally the Space Shuttle Challenger, because then that happened tomorrow. Like the confirmation bias that we don't even mean to do. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
normal way of interpreting our environment.
Right. Um, I had when I first found out that I was sensitive, because I did see my grandmother who had passed when I was 13,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't recall anything else happening um, to me that until I was in my 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started to actually feel stuff around me. For once I figured that out, for about a year, I had to close myself off from the world. I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't go to the grocery store. I couldn't go anywhere. And the few times that I did try to reach out and meditate and stuff, it just became so overwhelming. I literally would find myself in bed for days because I was so weak and I just felt drained. And That was a scary time for me. Have you ever gone through anything like that, or were you always just knew what to do?
I had a pretty good sense of boundaries, but your experience isn't unusual. My mom was what I'll call an empath, and
Uh-huh.
she never really learned. It was sort of antithetical to her abilities to block stuff out.
Hmm.
So going out in public, for a while, I think she was convinced that she was agoraphobic. But it was, she acknowledged it was definitely a psychic aspect to it. Like she would go places and just be so overwhelmed by all of the impressions coming in, everybody's emotions, like this great roiling sea. And her solution was to move out to the middle of nowhere. She used to live in a little place called the Colony, Texas, and she moved like 100 miles north of Dallas onto this cabin where like you went to a little town called St. Joe, and you went like 6 miles down the country road, and then you went off road onto this dirt road, and it's several miles down the dirt road, and then down the little bit that her pickup had, like just, and so
Right,
one room originally, like little one room thing, that like this was her artist retreat from the world, because it was the only place that she got any kind of peace,
right.
because everything else wrecked her.
Uh-huh.
um, and I think, well, I only grew up with my mom until I was in kindergarten. I reacquainted myself with her really in my like 20s. And the interesting thing with her when I was little, because sometimes, people believe one way and sort of like change because they doubt themselves, and she definitely was
Right,
there. So raising me as a tiny person, we did a lot of psychic exercises, and that really helped. And events in her own life meant that she sort of shut that door.
hmm,
I think partly because she was afraid of being judged. She was being judged from a lot of different directions at that point. And it wasn't until her 40s again that she started to like kind of pry it back open.
hmm.
I think a lot of people shut that door even without realizing it, because there's so much societal pressure. And even if there isn't the societal pressure, there's just so much involved in being a person. Like there's so many emotions, there's so many things to distract us, there's so many things to pull us away. And this is one big distraction that we just don't need, that we
Right,
can't. Um,
right.
and then when it pops back open, it's overwhelming, because it's been down there stewing and getting stronger. It's
Yeah.
been sort of like in like out of the corner of your psychic eye. Um, a lot of folks who are, especially like empaths,
Uh-huh.
emotion sensitive, because it's people that does it. There's somebody who picks up the energy of natural environments is far less likely to go to the grocery store and just find themselves on the floor because there's too many voices in their head.
Right.
The closest I came, and this was when I remember, this is really like the day, my aha moment of I need to shield from this, like I need some way to control this, was, oh God, I'm I think I was 14 or 15, and the Super Kmart opened in Medina, and it was a big to do.
Yeah.
And so my gram was there to get like all the bargain stuff, and she had me along to be the willing porter of all of the stuff. And we walked in, and I'm pushing the cart for my grandmother, and she's trying to talk to me, and I feel spacey, because to me it feels like everybody in this building is shouting, like it was just chaos, and I could not concentrate. I couldn't. It felt like I couldn't hear.
Hmm.
And my gram like kind of like slaps me on the arm, is like, hey, pay attention, like what's up with you, like we're going this
Right.
way. Like I can't hear you, it's really loud in here. And she's like, Mickey, because that was my nickname at the time, it it's not loud, like what are you even talking about?
Right.
And that was enough to go, oh, those are not voices with these ears. Those are, huh, huh, okay, well, I really don't like feeling this way, so let's not feel that way. and
Right.
and after that, I practiced going. I mean, I was a kid at that age in the 80s, so a goth of a certain age. So I ended up going to the mall when it was really busy and practicing, letting myself just sort of drift in that sea of
Right.
psychic input and sensation and feel how that sort of like really pulled me off kilter. And then what did it take for me to shut it down so I could think?
Right. I got to the point, it's not so much for me other people's emotions that I'm picking up.
Mm.
It's I get the physical sensations.
Oh,
I
that's
pick up
worse.
how a person died,
Mm.
the feelings that they went through. I pick up the high electromagnetic field around me. So even going under a fluorescent light, I'm like, oh my God, let's hurry up and get through the store, you know? But basically, it got to that point. I think we were going to, like, the first day of some comic movie, and it was packed. And I sat down, and that's all I was doing. I couldn't
Mm.
concentrate. I spent the whole time just, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of here. I'm being overwhelmed. And then from that point on, I think I just locked myself up. So it's hard.
Yeah. Well, and you're not going to find a whole lot of material on that. There's not many people. I mean, there are definitely people who are kinesthetic or proprioceptive with their psychic stuff. That it's tactile.
Uh-huh.
But that's incredibly overwhelming. And the worst part about that is like you literally can like walk across a spot where somebody had a heart attack, and suddenly you feel like you're having the heart attack.
Exactly.
And yes, I've helped a couple of people, and again, that's a fairly rare one.
Yeah,
And
that it's hard because
yeah.
I recently went on a ghost tour on a ship,
Mhm.
and I didn't know a lot of the history on this of this ship. However, when I was going through it, I started like losing my voice, and I felt
Mhm.
like my throat was just full of like smoke, like I was inhaling smoke constantly. It hurt so bad. And then when that part was over, I was told that there had been a fire
Mm.
in that area of the ship. And I was like, well, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I can't even talk. I completely lost my voice.
We
So,
had a lady on Paranormal State. It was a family in Maryland, and she was being attacked. But what it was she had the ability, like you do, where
uh-huh.
what she was feeling was she would get like these pains, and she was getting echoes, physical echoes of what was going on. All
Mm,
of her psychic stuff she processed as physical sensation first, and it was incredibly off-putting and overwhelming. Um,
mm-hmm.
once we figured that out, like I actually kind of did a little experiment during dead time where uh, I was like, okay, guys, don't tell her I'm going to do this, and I know that that's kind of sketchy, but I'm just going to do basically like Reiki from a distance, like
Mm-hmm.
send her some energy and see how does she react, because I really think what's going to happen is she'll perceive that as physical sensation first, and she's hit a point where she just assumes that that's something attacking her, as opposed to just her perceiving stuff, the way she perceives.
Mm-hmm.
And so a good portion of solving that haunting was just helping her navigate what was really incredibly upsetting ability.
Right. Right. And I finally got to the point where I was like, okay, I get it. The way it goes away for me is basically once it happens, I basically just say it. I spew it. I don't spew it to anybody around me. I just verbally just say, okay, I am picking up on you. Thank you. I get it. This is how you passed away. I'm sorry. And it usually goes away and
Mhm.
stops. But this is not something like I've made a career out of this or anything. It just happens to run in my family.
Yep.
We each have a different ability, and this one is mine. So I got the crappy one.
Hey guys.
So, but as far as like my mother is concerned, she told me forever, don't dabble in any of that.
Mm.
Don't do any of that. It's bad because she's very much a Catholic.
Yep. I was raised Catholic too, and the weird thing was is like it was okay to experience it, but it wasn't okay to study it, which I was like, but
Right.
I understand it better. Like,
Right. And she's the same. And she told me forever, stop, don't do the haunted thing. Don't go there. You don't want to
mm,
do any of that. That's all bad. But then just recently, it was funny. I went to visit her and she said, your dad is talking to me. Now my dad has
mm.
passed away. He's been gone for years. Your dad's been talking to me. I'm like, I thought you said not to talk about that stuff. And she goes, well, I didn't talk back. I'm just telling you, I'm hearing things. I'm like, okay.
that's the attitude that I don't understand. Where it's like, we know that it's real.
Right.
Catholicism is like the most mystical of the Christianities in the first place, like Holy Ghost and all of that, and
Right.
somehow we're just so wound up about, I don't know. If people only get out of their own way.
Right. And it's already been 30 minutes. And this has gone by so fast. I don't want to take any more of your time, but I so appreciate you talking to me. It was so much fun.
Oh, this is fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
I love this. Okay. So thank you for doing this, Michelle. And actually, you are going to be coming to Texas for an event.
I am. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to having you. And I am sure we will get a lot of comments and questions for you. So thank you again so
Yeah.
much
And if you want to do it
for
again,
taking the time to talk to me.
yeah, if you want to do it again at some point, just, shoot me a text.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Bye.
Bye.